Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, in our ongoing series about Pacific War naval battles, we're talking about Santa Cruz, one of the naval battles fought in the islands around Guadalcanal, and the fourth out of five carrier battles fought between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy during World War II. Previously, we had Coral Sea and more or less in a draw, Midway, and as a pretty resounding American victory, Eastern Solomons and more or less in a draw, and now we have Santa Cruz, which, not to spoil the ending, will end as a pretty conclusive Japanese victory. By this point in the war, the carrier air groups have changed significantly. They're still comprised of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighter planes. However, earlier in the war, the air groups tended to favor the attack aircraft, the bombers. Particularly torpedo bombers were expected to be dealing the killing blow to enemy ships. For the Japanese, especially, the Kate, their primary carrier torpedo bomber, was one of their more modern aircraft and probably the best in the world at that role. However, torpedo bombers are large, slow-moving, and have to fly really low to drop their payloads, and early war experience showed that they were not surviving. They were not getting successful strikes off. So by this point in the war, because of the number of airstrikes launched on each other, each side had increased the number of fighter planes on their carriers and decreased the number of torpedo bombers and to a lesser extent dive bombers. The United States had an excellent dive bomber in the Dauntless. The Japanese were using the Naval, which was probably their oldest and most obsolete of their carrier planes, but it was still a highly effective dive bomber with extremely skilled air crews flying. Even though the number of fighter planes had increased, so there were enough aircraft to both escort outgoing strikes and remain to form a combat air patrol to protect the carrier task forces, the fighters didn't really have a huge impact on this battle. They were neither able to defend their own carriers or deter incoming strikes. Nor did they play a significant role in driving off enemy fighter planes when they were escorting their own bombers. Really, the other side's mismanagement of fighters led more to that than the proper utilization of escorting fighters. So the battle is fought on 26th October 1942. So this is something like the third or fourth battle we've had within a couple of months in these waters. This is a huge departure from Japanese pre-war strategy. The whole Japanese strategy and shipbuilding philosophy going into the war was that they would take the vital resources controlled by colonial European powers near their home islands, and then they would take a ring of small islands out around those, so they would have a series of concentric defensive rings that an enemy fleet would have to fight through. And they successfully did this. They took the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and pushed all of the colonial powers out of the Western Pacific. And then they managed to successfully take several concentric rings of islands, with the Solomon Islands forming one of the outer layers. Their ships were all designed so that as an enemy fleet fought their way through their island defenses, that enemy fleet would presumably be larger than their own. Their ships, their fast, heavily torpedo-armed cruisers, destroyers, and carrier strike forces would be able to whittle down that incoming fleet alongside of land-based aviation from the islands they captured, so that by the time an American fleet was able to reach their former possessions in the Philippines, perhaps, to set up a staging area to directly attack Japan, they would be weakened to the point that the Japanese battle force, which would have started the war inferior, could have a good chance of winning. Individual Japanese battleships were designed to be faster than their Western counterparts, so they could choose the time and place of the battle and exploit tactical advantages. And later Japanese super battleships were designed to be able to handily defeat Allied battleships on a one-for-one basis and even stand up to them when outnumbered. However, when the war actually started, they threw this whole strategy out the window, and the first time they got punched in the face, the invasion of Guadalcanal, they completely reversed everything they were doing and threw absolutely everything they had into that struggle. And so we get 6 months of fighting around these islands, where the Japanese throw the cream of their military forces into combat on a more or less piecemeal basis, and have them destroyed, and then do not have the sufficient forces for their own pre-war strategy. The problem is they're fighting at the end of an extremely limited supply chain against an extremely aggressive Allied submarine force that is interfering with that supply chain. They cannot get enough troops on the Guadalcanal to win, enough supplies to those troops to keep them fed, or enough oil to their ships to send their whole fleet out in overwhelming numbers. And so this battle drags on and on and on with no chance of serious victory here. Historians have described this as victory disease. The Japanese had won so frequently in the early war that they thought that they just couldn't lose. Their tactics and equipment was just so superior. And that was true for a time, but it didn't last forever. And eventually, the United States was able to bring online more and more equipment and bring more weight to bear. So, the battle begins with Japanese land forces attacking Henderson Field, the Allied airfield on Guadalcanal. The Navy is tasked with supporting the Army's attack here, and they believe that they have the superior carrier force to do that. They come out to attack the Americans and drive the Navy away so that the Americans don't get resupplied, and so that their own forces can be supplied. The U.S. Navy has just replaced Admiral Gormley in command of the Southwest Pacific with Admiral Halsey, a far more aggressive commander, and he immediately deploys his two available carriers, Hornet and Enterprise. They're outnumbered by the Japanese carriers, but they know they're coming, and in previous battles, when the Americans know the Japanese are coming, they're able to launch pretty successful ambushes and at least hold their own. This time, both sides know they're coming. Japanese carriers carry only strike aircraft and fighters. The American carriers use some of their dive bombers as scout planes. The Japanese use cruiser-launched float planes as scout planes. They have superior long-range cruiser aircraft for this. It means that their carriers have to operate with their cruisers, but it means that more of their aircraft, and Japanese carriers do tend to carry a slightly smaller air group depending on the size of the carrier, but more of their aircraft are dedicated to actual strike functions. So both sides know the other one's coming. Both sides put up their scout planes. Because the Americans are using some of their dive bombers as scout planes, they cannot launch as large of a strike as they should be able to, and so their two carriers are even more outnumbered. The Japanese are able to launch a full strike. Both sides detect each other at more or less the same time, and both sides are able to tell that they have been detected. So each side immediately launches all of their aircraft to launch a strike, knowing from previous experience, there have been 3 other battles like this, the first side that can get a strike in is probably going to win, especially if you can catch your enemy with planes still on their deck. The American strike, in order to get off as quick as possible, as the aircraft are launched, immediately take off towards the Japanese fleet. This means they're going to attack piecemeal, but they might get a chance to get in there before the Japanese get them. The Japanese, on the other hand, have really, really well coordinated strike groups, and they're able to form up in formations and go out so that they can launch coordinated strikes with dive bombers and torpedo planes attacking American carriers from multiple directions at the same time. Luckily, the Americans have a bit of a weather advantage in that there are storm cells, and their carriers are able to dart in and out of these storm cells, and that renders them mostly immune to enemy aircraft. They can't even be seen, much less attacked. During the first strike, American aircraft are able to damage some of the Japanese carriers. Japanese aircraft are able to basically disable Hornet, which was out of the storm at the time, and the only carrier they could see. Enterprise, on the other hand, was in a storm and survived the first strike, but Hornet's basically knocked out of the battle. Enterprise is able to recover aircraft from both air groups and continue to operate. However, fighter direction is still pretty primitive, and even though they've got radar and a lot of fighter planes in the air, the Americans have a really tough time of coordinating and sending their aircraft after Japanese strikes, and so their fighters are mostly ineffective. The Japanese have not developed radar or airborne radio systems to be able to coordinate, and their aircraft perform the same way they have earlier in the war, which is when they see planes coming, they all attack, and they do a number to those, but then future strikes are able to get through because there's less fighters opposing them. Because strikes are launched piecemeal, successive American strikes are able to damage a couple of the Japanese carriers, but the Japanese are bringing 4 flight decks to the battle. Successive Japanese strikes are able to disable Hornet and severely damage Enterprise. And at the end of the day, Kincaid has to retreat. He tries to tow the damaged Hornet out, but later Japanese strikes are able to catch Hornet dead in the water and sink her before effective damage control can be handled. The Yorktown-class carriers are extremely survivable. However, their damage control parties need time to be able to effect that. After Midway and Coral Sea, when the Japanese carriers had retreated, they had that time. At Santa Cruz, the Japanese were left in control of the battlefield, not the Americans, and so they did not have the time, and Hornet was lost. So the battle ends in a success for the Japanese. They have driven the American carriers away. The United States now has no undamaged carriers in the Pacific. They have a couple of modern aircraft carriers under construction. Those won't get into the war for another couple of months. They have a couple of damaged carriers that have survived, but those won't get back in the war for a couple of months. They actually asked the British to borrow one of their small carriers from the Atlantic, and the British oblige, and for a couple of months give the United States one of their carriers. And then by then, more American ships are able to come into the fray. The Japanese aren't able to capitalize on this victory, however, because they lost so many of their trained aircrew. They trained their aircrews way better than anyone else in the world, but it took much longer. And the Japanese will never send another carrier force to sea with a trained aircrew. For the rest of the war, for the rest of the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this is the last time that full aircrews of trained Japanese pilots are able to operate. notified when we're putting out more content. And thanks for watching today.